I'm making this for Gabby. This is a Australian version of the sunrise shell, and this is a fairly deep contour, which is what I want for this type catch that I'm making. The plate is 0.7 thick. I've rolled out a coin, but all it needs is sheet. And this is basically going to be a ball and a slot type catch, but the base of the catch itself is going to be no soldering. So I'm going to draw around the shell, and I'm leaving enough space for my claws, because the base is going to be just held onto the shell with claws. Now mark where your claws are going to go, and I'm using 4 claws on this one. And then what I'm going to do is down here I'm going to leave a tab that I can drill for a jump ring. So leave a fairly generous amount. It's always easier to file and cut later. So now I'm going to punch out the disc that I'm going to use for the ball. So instead of a ball, I'm using a disc. But the part that I've traced out is going to be the setting for the shell, so that the shell will go on here, tabs will hold it in place, and then down here we'll have a hole in the slot, which will be the catch part. Now this shell is fairly deep on both ends. If you had one that was shallow on one end, what you do is you'd make sure that the hole was positioned so that when you put your ball or disc in, it would clear the shell. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to punch a disc out here, and then I'll use that disc to make the catch, and I'll just saw a slot. Yep. So I'll punch the disc. So there's my disc. It doesn't have to be huge. I'm using 2mm wire, so I'll solder that onto the disc. Then I cut a 2mm slot for this wire to go through. So I'm actually going to solder that on, file this nice and flat, solder that on hard solder, and then what we want is to make a bend that's only slightly thicker than this. So I may bend this before I solder it on, otherwise it's going to be difficult with the disc in the way. So anneal, file it flat, anneal it, get your nice tight bend, and then we'll try it for fit after we saw. So this about that long, 2mm wide. I just grabbed the end of the wire with my parallel jaw pliers and bent a nice tight end in it. So now I'm going to solder that onto my disc. We're using hard solder, and you can see I'm just holding this. The disc is flat on the charcoal block, and I'm holding the end in the third hand. And I always do plenty of wire because I want to get my third hand far enough away that it doesn't interfere with my soldering. So a fairly generous amount of hard solder. This is about 3mm piece. Heat up your solder pick, touch it to the solder, heat this up, and I circle, so I'm not focusing on the wire, but I'm circling the disc. Yep, quench it, pickle it. So while we're waiting for that to pickle, we'll saw out our slot, and I've scribed a line, 2 lines actually. So I'm going to saw just to the outside of the line. So now you can take your little jeweler's file or a slotting file and run down through there and just take a piece of your 2mm wire, and you want a snug fit but not a tight fit, not a loose fit. You want the wire to just go down through there. This is going to be a catch, so it's a bit like a keyhole at the moment. So I have my slot filed out so that the wire fits fairly comfortably. Now I can saw out this. So I'm just going to follow my design in Texture and leave these tabs really long because it's easy to cut them off later. So the tab is about 1.5 mil wide, and I've left it about 8 mil long, so that should be okay. Sorry. So drill a hole here for your jump ring. Tidy this up. Make sure it's nice and pretty. Put your claws over your shell to hold it. So this will be your jump ring. And then you can see that the disc that we cut out goes in fairly snugly, but it goes in. So what I would do is I would just turn this into a jump ring, and then you have one solder join, and I'd make it so that the jump ring came just past the end of this, so that when you look at it from this side, all you would see is your shell with the claws and the jump ring attached underneath. So it's a fairly invisible clasp, and if you use a big shell like this, it could be the feature of your bracelet or your pendant. So tidy this up, drill your hole, make this into a jump ring, solder it, and you're finished. So I've got the clasp pulled all the way to the end. I'm going to mark it with my texture, because when I use my flat round pliers to make my jump ring, that's where I want it to end up. If your disc is a little bit snug in your clasp, just sand the sides a little. You don't have to do the whole thing. So I'm going to make a fairly small jump ring, and I've just got my mark visible on the other side of my pliers. And then I'm going to bend that back a little. Hold it with my parallel jaw pliers so I get the bend where I want it. And then I'll saw that off and solder it. So drill your hole for your jump ring in that little tab, anneal these tabs if they aren't already, and bend them up 90 degrees with your parallel jaw pliers. you can wait to sand all of this and tidy it up until you make sure that it fits correctly. So I've got the tabs bent straight up, and what I do is I rest my pliers on the high part of the shell with the back, yeah, and cut them off, and that way I know there's plenty of tab. Then we'll lightly file that, sand it, and I would polish the whole thing before I set the tabs. It's still rough, it needs to be tidied up, but that is the catch that I would make for this particular piece. Done. Well, not done. Needs to be tidied up and made pretty. So that's the idea.